listening to the podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood, and today I'm going to be doing an episode talking about how to get into podcasting if you are a company or a brand and have never had any experience with podcast. Where should you start? So first, I want to discuss interviews. I think interviews are a really good way to get a taste of what podcasting can do for you. The greatest thing about interviews is that they can be free. So if you have a marketing or PR team, you certainly can ask them to reach out to potential podcasts to try and coordinate interviews with either someone in your marketing department, the CEO of your company. There are certainly lots of different options in terms of who you could have interviewed from your company. But it's nice because, as I said, you can do it for relatively little money. Now, if you want to do a wide-reaching interview campaign, you want to have someone on your team interviewed a lot, you could also hire an interview booking company. And there are a number of these organizations out there that just specialize in finding podcasts that you can be interviewed on. So those can be really good options for you as well. Granted, you're going to pay money for those, so it isn't free, but I think it really gives you a taste of podcasting. And what I like about interviews as well is that in general, it's going to be about 30 minutes in length. Granted, there are going to be shows that are shorter, some shows that are longer, but you're going to have 30 minutes to really tell the story of the brand. You're going to be able to talk about why your product is so great, or kind of the initiatives that you're taking, the new projects that you're working on. You have the ability in that interview to really dictate the messaging and craft a narrative around your company and your organization that is going to give you a sense of the real power of podcasting. Now, I do have a few tips when you're thinking about setting up interviews. The first is that you want to make sure that you do have KPIs set around your interviews. Why are you doing interviews, and what are you hoping to get out of the interviews? And I also cannot overexpress how important it is to have a clear CTA in mind, a call to action during that interview. Every interview is going to be different, and not all interviewers are going to give you an opportunity to, specifically give your contact information or to really clearly articulate a CTA. So it is important that you kind of weave the messaging into the interview. And, one of one of the stories that I probably have told on this show before, but that I really like to share, is I was talking to a podcaster one day that was trying to increase listenership of their show. And I said, you should be doing interviews. And this host said that they had been doing lots of interviews. And I said, well, at the end of the interview, are you asking people to come and listen to your show? And the host said, oh, no, I usually ask them to buy my book. And I'm like, okay, there's a disconnect here. This is an issue. If you are not having a clear call to action about what you're trying to get out of that interview, then it makes it really difficult to really try it out and see what kind of result you're going to be getting. And when I say a CTA, I think that could be things like, is there a particular product that you're trying to get people to purchase? So are you talking about that? And are you talking about a special that you have around that product? Do you maybe have a newsletter that you're really wanting to get subscribers to, and knowing that if you get them on your newsletter, you can then remarket to them or retarget them in some capacity? So coming up with what that win is going to be for you through that interview, and then trying to clearly communicate that in not a salesy way, but just a way that's clear that, hey, you want people to take this action, is a really good way just to make sure that you're getting traction with your interviews. The other thing that can be tricky, and when I say this, I always feel like it's a duh moment, but try to get interviews on larger shows or shows that are very, very well aligned with your product, right? So if you have a special supplement company and you can align with a podcast that speaks directly to, maybe the products that you're creating or the mission that you have, there's going to be a strong alignment there. Or if you're even something that's more obscure, like you're a veterinarian going on a podcast for veterinarians, there's going to be a really strong alignment there. So audience size doesn't matter as much if the alignment is really strong. But if you're really wanting to see the power of podcasting, if you can get on a show that does have a decent sized audience, you can really test whether or not you're seeing a response from that. And I mention this because so many podcasts are very small and we don't realize this, right? On the outside, it looks like, hey, it's successful, it's great. But when you look at their actual audience size, they can be really small. And so it could be a terrific interview and that's great. But if you're not reaching a lot of people with that interview, it's going to be a challenge. So try to see if you can identify podcasts that are going to be more sizable for interviews as well and try to pitch those first. Of course, there's going to be more competition to get on those shows because everyone wants to get on the larger shows. But at the end of the day, it's going to be well worth your effort. The other thing that you need to make sure that you're doing with those interviews is getting permission from that show to repurpose the interview. So making sure that you're putting it out on your social, that you're sending it out in your newsletters, that you are communicating in any way that you can with your customer base or prospects that you were in this interview or on this interview, because that again is going to be a really good place for you to tell the story of your company and your products and convert from that. So I think interviews can be a really good place to start if you have no experience in podcasting. Next, you might think about creating a podcast for your company. And that is a huge endeavor. And I've talked to people who are like, I invest $20,000 an episode. No joke, right? Like they invest a ton of money to create a podcast. I've also talked to companies that are like, hey, we produce it internally. We've got a great mic and our marketing person does the editing and it really hasn't been a big lift for us. So there's a huge range when you're creating a podcast that can happen. And so it really depends on what your investment level looks like. So you may say that it's interview first, branded podcast second, advertising third, or you may say it's branded podcast would fall at the very end or the very beginning, one of the two, because of the investment that it could potentially cost you to create a show. So it all really depends on how you're going about creating a podcast. But again, the nice thing about having a podcast for your company, number one, you're going to reach your potential prospects and your customers in a way that some of your customers really love, which is through audio. I know myself, I'm an audio person, right? I even actually just downloaded this great app that reads articles to me, right? That aren't even audio articles. So if you're someone that really loves audio and some of your customers are going to be that, they're going to really resonate with the message that you're putting out in a branded podcast. One of the most important considerations with branded podcasts, though, is you want to make sure that you're telling a story and that you are not just creating a 30 or 45-minute ad, right? No one is going to listen to that. It's not going to be interesting. So you really have to think about a branded podcast from an angle that is going to be a story either about your customers or someone that you impact with your products or the journey of a product. You just get creative with the type of content that you're creating around that branded content. And in some instances, maybe it doesn't even have anything to do with your product. Maybe it's like a secondary benefit or it's a cause that the organization really wants to get behind. And so you're creating a podcast about human trafficking, but that's a cause that your organization really gets behind, and you're going to create this great show and it's going to be brought to you by your organization. Because ultimately what you're trying to do is you're trying to create energy, brand awareness, and purchase intent around that podcast. And so how are you creating that? How are you creating potentially goodwill for your product? All of those wonderful marketing elements can go into creating a branded podcast. Next, you can think about advertising, which of course I would say should maybe be your first consideration. But advertising can be a little bit tricky sometimes when you think about podcast. And the reason that I say it could be tricky is because there are so many different options that you could try. There are so many different shows that you could try. There's a lot of different investment levels. So depending on where you're at in your organization, you may decide that you want to try some of these other items, like interviews or having your own podcast before you venture into podcast advertising. It all really depends a lot on your personal goals and what you really are trying to accomplish with venturing into podcasting. What are you trying to get out of it? But with advertising, there certainly are a few different ways that you can test the water. As much as I love the host read ad, and I'm going to talk about host read ads in just a second, you can try programmatic advertising depending on where you're at. You may not see the exact same level of return. You probably won't see the same level of return with programmatic as you would with a host read ad, but programmatic and run of network options can be really good. And when we talk about programmatic or we talk about run of network, the key ingredient to those ad placements really is going to be a produced ad spot, right? It's a spot that you as a company have generated. You're very aware about the messaging. And then you also have really great targeting capabilities with programmatic or run of network, where you can come in and say, hey, this is exactly who we're looking to reach. We don't care which podcast it's on. It doesn't have to be on this specific show. We just want to get the message out in front of our customers. Programmatic and run of network do tend to be a lower rate than a host read ad would be. So there can be a lot of real advantages to testing in programmatic or run of network, especially if it's a first time for you. If you've got some specific goals, that can work really well. Now let's talk about the power of the host read ad. The host read ad is definitely one of the most effective methods of using the podcast industry as a marketing vehicle. And the reason that host read ads are so effective is that we know that that host of that show has a very committed audience. The host knows their audience, they speak their audience's language. And when they are talking about your product or your service, there is so much power in that. One of the things that we have to always think about with any form of advertising that I sometimes don't think we discuss enough is there is so much competition for attention, right? We are surrounded by everything that bings and dings and lights up and asks for our attention all day long. And so when we think about really having an impact with our brand or creating that traffic that we're looking for, we first have to get the attention of the customer. If we don't have the attention of the customer, then we're not going to be able to effectively communicate our message. And that's one of the great things about the host read ad is people are listening to podcasts because they want to be there, right? And that's the case for all of these different options with podcasts, right? Whether it's an interview or a branded show or advertising, you are there as a listener because you want to be there and you're going to consume the content in a different way because of that. And it's just so intentional and the audiences are so engaged that there's a lot of effectiveness. Now, when you take an already established audience, you put your brand message in front of them and your messaging is communicated to that listener by someone that they already know, like, and trust, there are so many opportunities to get real results, to get a return from those ad dollars that are spent. And that is why host read ads are something that you definitely should consider, because if you're not really making that strong connection, you're not going to get the return that you're really looking for. And that's what host read ads can offer you. They do tend to be more expensive than a programmatic option, but they're maybe not as expensive as producing your own show. They probably aren't as expensive even as paying for someone to go and book you on different podcasts as a guest. So there are lots of different options and different avenues that you can explore with podcasts. But I definitely think that if you are a brand or you're a company that is doing nothing in podcasting right now, I would say that you're missing the boat, because podcast listeners are very, very dedicated, and they are people that oftentimes you can only reach through podcasting because they aren't those mass consumers of content in other forms. They are very, very dedicated to their shows, to the audio that they want to listen to, and being there, being present in the podcast space is really very valuable for your brand. So I would highly recommend that you consider adding podcasting into your overall marketing mix for 2025. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I hope that it has been helpful and given you some ideas as we think about our marketing planning for the upcoming year. If you haven't had a chance to check out my YouTube channel, please do head on over to YouTube, and we will catch you again next time. Thank you for listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast advertising industry.